Hi, everyone, and welcome to our NeuroQ live series on the Bredesen 7 key lifestyle habits developed by Dr. Dale Bredesen to support brain health and protect memory. I'm Nikki Wolf, today back for episode 7, this time to discuss a super important and interesting topic when it comes to brain health, and that is supplementation. Now, the foods we eat don't necessarily meet the nutritional needs for a healthy brain, and that's where supplementation comes into play. Taking daily supplements provides those key ingredients to support memory and thinking over a lifetime. Dr. Dale Bredesen returns today to explain which supplements we should be taking to protect our brain health at different stages of life. We'll also learn the best herbs to optimize cognitive performance. So let's give a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Bredesen. He is a world-renowned neurologist pioneering the treatment of Alzheimer's. He's authored 2 New York Times bestsellers, including The End of Alzheimer's, and currently is a professor at UCLA. Dr. Bredesen, thank you for joining us again today.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Great to talk to you.
Likewise. We very excited for this conversation today as we are deep in the supplement field. So let's just start with the basics. Can you tell us, why is supplementation important for brain health?
Yeah, that's a great point. Supplements are supplementary, so everything else should be done first. And the reality is, if you look across the population, most of us don't get enough omega-3s, as an example. So you look at your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, it should be 3 or 4. The average American, it's 15. So you get way too much of the pro-inflammatory omega-6s and way too little of the anti-inflammatory omega-3s. Vitamin D, so many people are low in that. We should be up there in the 50 to 80 range, and so many people are down at 15 or 20. That you're getting suboptimal brain support, suboptimal immune support, suboptimal vascular support. B12 is another one where many people are low. You should be up there in the 500 to 1,000 range. Many people are at the 350 range, which is damaging in terms not only of anemia, but is also damaging in terms of your neural function. So all of these things. So the bottom line is, you don't, for most of us, we are off on some of these things. And again, in a perfect world, diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, and some detox, everything should be great. But again, just as we live in a toxic world where we've got to make up for the fact that we are exposed to toxins, we also live in a world in which the soil's not perfect, the diets are not perfect, the food is not perfect. We're exposed to a lot of processed foods and things that really are not very good in terms of nutritional value. So it's a good idea, and the great news is there are many, many different supplements that can help you to get optimal, give you the best performance and the best protection for long term for your brain.
Great. And, I even think about when you were talking about vitamin D, we're loading our bodies with all this sunscreen. We're not able to produce all these levels of vitamin D that we're needing. So it sounds like there's a lot of different things we can be taking. Now, for the average healthy person, are all those ingredients that you mentioned or supplements, are those what we should be taking? Is there something a little bit different? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great point. So if you know your levels, then that's the best way to actually know what you do. And then what you do is you just supplement what's not optimal. But if you don't know your levels, there are some basics just based on the fact that most people, and so you think about it this way, most people are deficient in several things. Most people are deficient in zinc, for example. Most people are deficient in magnesium. Most people are deficient in choline, which is why I like things like acetylcholine and alpha-GPC. And by the way, choline, one of the most important ones for prevention of Alzheimer's. And there was just an interesting recent article showing that vitamin D was associated with reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. So that's another important one. It's also associated with reduced risk for multiple sclerosis. So it's a good idea not only to have enough choline to make that acetylcholine, which is so critical for memory, but also a good idea to have enough vitamin D to impact your immune system. We've heard a lot about it, of course, because of COVID-19. people who are low in vitamin D tend to do more poorly with COVID-19. So those are some important ones and common ones that are low. For many people, potassium is also low, and iodine is also low. Those are kind of some of the major ones that are low. And then, as I mentioned earlier, omega-3s. For most of us, we have a little too much omega-6 and a little too little omega-3. So I really like some of the omega-3 supplements, especially DHA and EPA, which are really helpful. And then even resolvins that are helping us to resolve the ongoing inflammation that so many of us have, as people have coined the term, inflammaging. Inflammation that's associated with the aging process. And so many of the diseases we associate with aging, from Alzheimer's to cardiovascular disease to metabolic syndrome, all of these are associated with ongoing inflammation. And so resolving that is helpful. And as we've always talked about, not just resolving your inflammation, but finding out what's causing it. Do you have leaky gut? Are you exposed to some pathogen? Things like that. Very important for the long run, but for the short run, please address the inflammation. And so omega-3s, very good way to do that. And by the way, DHA, the longer chain of the omega-3s, also very important for synapse formation. So if you want to have more synapses, and this is some really nice work coming out of MIT by Professor Wertman over many, many years, showing that both acetylcholine and DHA very helpful for formation of synapses.
And, for the average listener, synapses, if you were to kind of condense the reason behind supporting that or taking something to benefit that, what would that be?
Yeah, so synapses are the connections in your brain, and these are critical. This is where the neurons, the brain cells, talk to each other. And literally, this is very much like the size of memory, the storage in your computer, your RAM in your computer. As you have fewer of them, you are not going to perform as well. You're not going to remember as well. You're not going to be as functional and as sharp as you were. And that's exactly what happens in Alzheimer's disease. You lose the wonderful synapses that you have. We have on average about 500 trillion of these synapses. So many, many synapses that do a fantastic job. You've really got a supercomputer inside your skull. But as you start damaging that, as you have inflammation and pathogens and things like that, and sleep apnea and leaky gut and all the things that happen to us over our lifespans, then what happens is we're now starting to downsize on the number of synapses. So we want to be keeping that as high as possible. And again, DHA and acetylcholine, or DHA and alpha GPC, a part of the overall approach to keep your synapse number as high as possible. And I should add things like whole coffee fruit extract. So this is why we put whole coffee fruit extract into NeuroQ, because it bumps the activity, bumps the amount of your brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And we talked earlier about inflammation, and yes, with that, both propolis and curcumin, which are both anti-inflammatories, also part of NeuroQ. So that's why they're there. Everything in there is there for an important scientific reason.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And so it sounds like we have a lot of takeaways for supplementation for the average person. But what about for somebody who's already showing signs of cognitive decline? What would you recommend for them?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So there is a distinction between, if everything's great and you're there for optimal performance and prevention of any future cognitive decline, keeping your brain health good, then there's fewer things that you need to do, but you do want to keep your inflammation low. You do want to keep your cholinergic activity high. You want to keep your support. You want to keep your vascular system in good shape as well. But as you indicated, if you're getting to the point where you're already starting to notice change, and when I was training everybody we saw with Alzheimer's, we were talking about 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now we know that this process begins about 20 years earlier. So even into your late 30s, people sometimes will begin to notice changes. Often you will not notice anything for years. There was a recent study done where people knew who was going to get Alzheimer's because they just looked at those few people who had familial Alzheimer's, who had gene mutations giving them Alzheimer's. And they could begin to see changes, for example, in GFAP, which is a molecule coming from your brain, indicating that your brain is now starting to be damaged. They could see that showing up in their blood 10 years before they even had the first symptoms. And once you develop symptoms, you have another 10 years where you have what's called where you have what's called SCI. Excuse me. So this is subjective cognitive impairment, which ultimately leads up to MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment, which within a few years typically leads up then to dementia. So the good news is we have a long runway. And so for those people who are beginning to have symptoms, please get treatment as early as possible and get evaluated. What we recommend is to get a cognoscopy, find out what is driving this. And then you can kind of break down what sort of supplementation as part of an overall program that would include your nutrition, a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet, as we've talked about before, exercise, strength training, both aerobics and strength training, all these things. But then what you'd want to do is look at, if you just kind of go with the different subtypes. So you've got an inflammatory subtype, that is common in people. And so that's where you want to go with the resolvins and with your omega-3s and curcumin and propolis. And even for some people, they will need some pregnenolone if they're low in their pregnenolone, which is a common one. And all these things can be obtained over the counter. And then the second thing you'd think about is glycotoxic. So for some people, they will need to have better glucose control. In most cases, you can do that just with your diet, appropriate sleep, and appropriate exercise, so diet and lifestyle. But for those where that doesn't quite work, you can add things like berberine or bergamot, both very helpful. And then we go into type 2, which is the atrophic type, and so some people will then want to include whole coffee fruit extract, as we've talked about before. You can bump up your nerve growth factor with alcar or with lion's mane mushroom, for example. And then we think about type 3, which is the toxic, and that's a whole field unto itself. And so you want your glutathione to be high. You think about also sulforaphane, which increases your glutathione levels. I like to use S-acetyl glutathione. Some people like to use liposomal glutathione. All those very helpful. And then you can also think about energetics. You want to increase your NAD, and so nicotinamide riboside is an important one that people use for that, or NMN is another one that also will bump your levels. And then type 4 we think about is vascular. And so if there's any question about your vascular status, again, reducing your homocysteine, and that's with B6, B12, and folate. And typically we use methylfolate and methyl B12. In some cases we need both methyl and adenosine cobalamin to do that. So, which is, by the way, in the Recode supplements. So all of these things can be critical. And then type 5 is traumatic, and for people who've had trauma, we do want to calm the inflammation if that's ongoing, if it's been relatively recent trauma. And then we also want to add the support, including the whole coffee fruit extract, to increase your BDNF, alcar or lion's mane to increase your NGF, and want to make sure also that your hormones are appropriate. And some people, again, will have hypothyroidism just because they are low in iodine or because they are low in tyrosine. So we want to make sure that those are optimized as well. So it depends on what you actually show with these things. But the great news is the armamentarium is huge. If you simply know what you need, or if you simply are working with someone who knows what you need, you can really fill in the blanks very, very well. And we see again and again, we see very positive outcomes.
Great. Thank you for diving into that. And two questions that I pulled away from that is, you mentioned trauma. That is, I'm assuming, physical, emotional, kind of a combination of all different types of trauma. Is that correct?
Yes. And again, we're talking mostly about head trauma, but you're right. The whole issue of mental trauma, and ACE, for example, ACE is adverse childhood experiences, no question that increases risk for decline in the future.
Okay. And then one last thing, you mentioned atrophic. So for those, and that was one of the types, what does that mean, kind of in layman's terms?
That's a great point. And so this is type 2 atrophic. And the point here is that you don't have enough support to operate your brain. So imagine, if you're driving your car around, you've got to have the appropriate amount of gas and oil. You've got to have transmission fluid. You've got to have the tires on there. You've got to have all the things that make it so your car is actually working. So, your car can have a problem because someone rammed into it, okay, but it can also have a problem because it just doesn't have enough of the support that it needs to go. It's either run out of gas or it's run out of oil, so forth and so on. And that's the same thing happens with your brain. So your brain needs the appropriate support, and we think of it in 3 different areas. It needs enough trophic factor support, so that is BDNF and nerve growth factor and things like that. It needs enough hormonal support, and that is estradiol and testosterone and progesterone, pregnenolone, thyroid, DHEA, all those things have enough to keep all these 500 trillion synapses going. So I'm actually going to retreat. So when we think about it, when you develop Alzheimer's, it's really about 2 major things. Immune activation, what's causing that inflammation, what's causing the problem. Is it pathogens? Is it from your oral microbiome? Is it leaky gut? Is it an infection you got? What is it? But then that's divided by energetics. If your energetics are really good, you'll do better. If your energetics are poor, you will do worse. You'll start to downsize more. So your brain is dealing with this all the time. And what we're seeing is very interesting and suggests that the brain actually has a program to take away the less important things. And it's interesting, we would think, well, my gosh, isn't your memory the most important thing? Well, no. If I said, Nikki, tomorrow morning you can either wake up and not have a very good memory, or you can not know how to speak, then you would know which one to take. So memory is actually, for your human survival, it's actually one of the less important things. You've gotten to a certain point in your life, you've learned how to do a lot of stuff, and you could survive for a long time just on knowing those things. So if we want to keep our memory sharp, we have to remember memory is kind of a luxury for the brain. After you've learned all the basic things you need to learn as a kid, and you can read and write, and you can communicate, and you can get on your computer, you can do all these wonderful things, you can dance and drive your car and all that sort of stuff. So it's great to learn new things, but if you are bad to your brain, if you're having it inflamed, if you're not supporting it in the right way, that's going to be the first thing to go. And that's exactly what you see as people are developing Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned previously, we kind of briefly discussed sleep. Do you have any special or specific supplements you would recommend for sleep?
Yeah. So actually, I actually used one last night, which is called Sleep Now. I actually happen to like that, which has got some L-theanine in it. It's got an appropriate amount of melatonin in it. And I find you can try, half a strip, a third of a strip, the whole strip, see what works best for you. And so, because different people need different amounts to get the best sleep. But that's a good one that I like. Of course, good sleep hygiene, also important. So you want to have things quiet at night. You want to turn off your Wi-Fi. You want to make sure that you're not in a place that's got loud noises. You want to make sure that it's dark. So I always notice, if I'm in a big city like New York City, I can tell when the garbage trucks are coming. I can tell, there's probably going to be police sirens and ambulance sirens and all these sorts of things. It's much harder to sleep. So get to quiet down. That's the other thing that I run into. If you're working right up until you go to sleep, it's probably not a good thing. You're seeing that blue light, so you want to turn down that blue light, that very highly energetic light, for a few hours before you go to bed. You don't want to be eating things that are going to keep you up at night. So you want to have good sleep hygiene, and then you want to make sure that that you're not dropping your oxygenation. So you can see very easily with a wearable, whether you like Apple Watch or whether you like an Oura Ring or a Fitbit, these sorts of things. will tell you where your oxygen status is while you're sleeping. If you're dropping below 92, you should be up at 96 to 98. It's fine. 94 is not so bad. Not even 92. But if you're dropping down into the 80s and 70s, and I just heard about someone the other day who was telling me they had dropped into the 30s, which is hard to believe.
Wow.
If you're dropping in there, you're not getting appropriate oxygenation, and you're not going to have as good and as restful of a sleep. You're probably now going to get some adrenaline going to wake you up to say, hey, your oxygenation is dropping too low.
Yeah.
So those are the sorts of things that I like to do to optimize sleep.
Great. And when you're taking those supplements, I mean, I think everything is a little bit different. I know the strips are very fast acting, but would you recommend, taking something maybe 30 minutes before you want to fall asleep? What's that sweet spot?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it depends if you're going to take it as a capsule. Yes, you'd probably want it more like 30 minutes. Some people will even do an hour. I like the strips because they're relatively fast acting, so I just take them as I'm going to bed, and it's kind of easier to do it that way. But it depends on how you like to do it. Different people like different ways. So all these things work. See where you're getting the best outcomes.
Absolutely. Now, what kind of herbal supplements would you recommend for stress or relieving stress?
Right. So there are a number of these, and rhodiola is a good one. That's kind of the standard for people who have a lot of stress. And then often people will supplement that and have things like Schizandra is another one, because so many of us have poor adrenal function. If you've been under a lot of stress during your life, you may have some suboptimal adrenal function, and you may need to supplement. Check your pregnenolone and find out. You may need to supplement it with some pregnenolone, which is easy to do, or some DHEA is another good one to do. And then ashwagandha is another one that people like. It's a relaxing supplement. It helps to kind of tone things down, and it is an adaptogen. So it helps you whether you're too high or too low. It kind of helps you get to a midpoint. By the way, also helps in the removal of amyloid, and that was published a number of times after several years ago. And so actually there are ongoing trials looking at just ashwagandha as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's. I have to say, I think you're missing a lot of the things that are driving the problem, but it's a start.
Absolutely. Ashwagandha is one of my favorites. Life Seasons has an adrenal formula, adrenal tea, that I live by and has many of those common ingredients that you mentioned.
Great.
Now, lastly, kind of before we round out, as far as performance enhancing products. So we've talked about, products for the average consumer, the one who maybe they're seeing decline, but what about for that individual who wants to take it up a notch?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think of these in two groups. There are performance things that you can do in the short term to get a good outcome, but then the problem is they're not good for you in the long run. And the classic is Adderall. You're literally kind of whipping. It's a kind of thinking of it, the way you could think of your car or even riding a horse. Your car, you're able to go very, very fast with your car for a short period of time, but your car's not going to last as long. On the other hand, what you'd like is good performance and long-lasting. And so, for example, things like Huperzine A, which has been used for years and, of course, is in the extra strength NeuroQ formula. What that does is increase your cholinergic tone. It inhibits the breakdown of the acetylcholine that you're already making. Another one people will use Bacopa. Bacopa also has a similar effect, and Bacopa has been used for thousands of years, supports better thinking. Go-To Cola is another good one, and by the way, that's also in the NeuroQ formula. Go-To Cola helps you to focus, helps you, again, better performance. Then there are, of course, the whole so-called nootropics, or some people call these nootropics, nootropics. And these are typically support, but again, these are often on the side of kind of pushing things into high gear and not necessarily great for the long run. So you want to take those sparingly when you need them. I recommend for some people who actually have Alzheimer's disease and are doing well with and improving, if they've got a morning where they have to be at their tip-top sharp take a small amount of Adderall. That actually helps. But again, I would never recommend that for the long term because you're kind of overdriving the system. It's a short-term answer, but not a long-term answer.
Great.
So those are some of the things. And what about you? Do you have favorites that you like to use?
I love Huperzine A. Right now, just during pregnancy, I can't take anything, but for somehow my brain is still functioning at this point. But once baby comes, but I think coming back to your standard, your omegas. I do love Huperzine A, and just the fact that it helps prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine, and I want as much of that in my body as I absolutely can.
Yeah, and of course, again, as we talked about earlier, the alpha GPC and the acetylcholine give you the precursors for acetylcholine, and having that is supportive. And you also don't want to forget the important other neurotransmitters. So, for example, tyrosine, which is important, for example, as a precursor to some of the noradrenergic signaling, which is support for things like dopamine, which kind of give you that positive feedback. And then, of course, norepinephrine, which is your alertness. And I should mention, when people, again, we talked about how long it is before you ever develop Alzheimer's. When you start to have those changes in your brain, the thing that actually changes first anatomically that you can actually see disappearing in your brain is something in your brainstem called the locus ceruleus, and it is the source of the norepinephrine, the noradrenaline that is coming to your brain. So this is why people kind of lose their drive as they're developing cognitive decline. So we want to keep that going. At the same time, we don't want to overstress people. So as with everything else, it is a wonderful balance to get best outcomes.
And what is it called? Locus ceruleus?
Locus ceruleus. It literally means blue spot. It's the place in your brain that is blue.
It sounds like a Harry Potter spell or a character.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, it
Very
does.
Cool. Well, for those of us watching, there is so much to take away from here, whether you're that average consumer reaching cognitive decline or just want to boost your performance. Thank you so much, Dr. Bredesen. This has been fascinating as always, and I just appreciate your time, taking the time to go into detail about these different natural ways to support brain health.
Always great to talk to you, Nikki. Take care.
Likewise. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
You can support cognitive health and performance with NeuroQ brain supplements. NeuroQ is a full range of brain-boosting formulas that work together. From stress management and better sleep to nutritional support, customize your brain health routine by stacking each formula. Shop at neuroq.com. NeuroQ Memory and Focus is also available at thousands of stores across the United States, including Sprouts, Air One, Whole Foods, Natural Grocers, Fresh Time Market, Mother's Market Kitchen, and Clark's Nutrition. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Take care.